Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again, Juliet Glamars Creations. The supply I've got for you today is something I've been using quite recently. Here it is. It's this bias binding. So it comes in all sorts of widths, and this one's actually a satin effect. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. So it comes in all sorts of sizes and textures. This one's a linen one, that one's a linen one, that one's wider, but I think that one's 25 millimeters wide. I've also got a thinner one here. And if they're shop bought, they usually come like this. So they're double folded, like that. So I've been using some bias binding. You can use it, it's such handy stuff. You can use it for all sorts. Trimming cushions or necklines of sleeveless dresses or tops or whatever, necklines. So it's really, really handy. But something I've been doing this week I wanted to show you is this. So I've been doing Hong Kong binding, which means that when you sew a garment, I'm actually doing a jacket here, and this is the back seam. You sew the seam together, you press it open, and then instead of overlocking or zigzagging or using the pinking shears to finish your edges, you actually Hong Kong bind using bias binding. I'll show you how it's done. So what you need to do first of all is iron your bias binding flat. So mine came, as you can see, it came folded. Just iron it completely flat. So the next stage is to sew it. This is my seam here. You press the seam open. You can see the seam is pressed open, and then you lay your bias binding on one of the edges here, and you sew it with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now this bias binding is actually 20 millimeters wide. I wouldn't use anything less than that because it would make your life very, very difficult. And I wouldn't use, this seam here is actually 1/4 an inch, sorry. I think that's making things quite difficult, but if you've got a 1.5 centimetre or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, this works perfectly. My kimono that I keep on going on about, I Hong Kong bound the inside of that, and that was 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 seam allowance. I'll show you what that looks like. So here it is. So you can see the wider your seam allowance, the easier this is going to be to apply, and the flatter it's going to lie. So that works quite well. 5/8 with the 20 millimeter bias binding. So that's the difference. You can see this one's trickier because you've got less fabric to work on in the seam. But both look good. So back to the technique. You sew it onto one side of your seam, the outside, and then you iron it back flat. You press it flat like that. So once you've pressed it away like that, you then turn it over that 1/4 inch that you sewed to the seam, and you pin it in the ditch, which means you pin it along just in that seam there, the stitching of the seam, and then you take it back to the sewing machine and you stitch in that ditch right in there to neaten it up. Now what's going to make stitching in the ditch a lot easier is this stitch in the ditch foot. That's what it looks like on the machine. There we go. you do is you just keep that blade in the seam and you can stitch right on top of that seam, keeping it in the ditch. So this is what I mean. That blade I'm keeping right where I stitched the bias binding on, and I've turned it over and I've pinned, and then I'm stitching right in that seam line there for a neat finish. So once you've done that, the only job left to do is to trim this off the back. And the scissors that I use to do this, you can get really close, are these duck-bill scissors. And I have a video all about these scissors. They're called applique scissors as well, because you can get this part really flat under this part and cut really close to that stitch line. There we are. So I've trimmed back to the stitching. I could go even closer really on this. And then the last thing to do is to press that nice and flat. And there you have it, Hong Kong binding to neaten the seams. Really looks professional, especially when you're not lining something like a jacket or a kimono or something. Looks really smart. So your inside looks as good as your outside of your garment. So I hope you found that helpful. It's another way of finishing off your garments. And if you've done it and you love it, pop it in the comments box. If you've never given it a go, try it. And try it on something simple first of all and see how you get on. So happy sewing everyone. Bye for now and have a great week.